There's an old saying that everyone learns by experience. It's just a lot easier when it's someone else's. In one sense, that's all that history is, being proactive about learning from other people's mistakes, rather than waiting to make those mistakes yourself. Those of you who have listened to my podcasts over the past few years will know how I feel about the discipline of history. It's been one of the great joys in my life, and I believe it's made me a better thinker, a better person, and a more responsible citizen. I think it does that for all of us when we're willing to set aside our assumptions and look frankly and interrogatingly at the past. I've invited a personal friend and a professor at a nearby university, Dr. Mark Smith, onto the podcast to help us do this. He'll be joining us for a brief series of conversations in which we'll explore ways in which different local and national histories can help us think more clearly about the present in the present. Mark is a humble, insightful student of history, a professor of the year at his school, Indiana Wesleyan University. And I'm thrilled to have him here. So welcome, Mark, to the show.
Thanks for having me on. Happy to be here.
I was complaining about America's two-party political system the other day, and Mark had pumped the brakes on that a little bit and changed my mind. I've always been a little frustrated with the fact that when it comes to any major election, we're pretty much stuck with the two old, entrenched political powers when there are so many other interesting viewpoints worth exploring. Every once in a while, a third party or independent candidate makes some noise, like Ross Perot did in the 90s. But for the most part, it's simply a two-horse race that leaves everyone else in the dust. We've never had the kind of wide-open elections that have been more common in Europe. For example, where you might have 10 or 15 political parties vying for power. That's always sounded more exciting to me, from the debates on down. What I'd like to see is debates with 10 different parties, not 10 different people from the same party. Mark pointed out that the two-party system might look like a failure of democracy, while it has actually been something of a safeguard against political chaos, as flawed and as frustrating as it may be. Sometimes the more spread out political power becomes, the better chance extremists have of taking control. And when they do take control, they often end democracy altogether. So, you might say that there have been times in history when democracy has obliterated itself by virtue being so overwhelmingly democratic. There's a really interesting and bizarre irony in this idea, and I'd like Mark to explain more about it.
That day we were talking, probably at breakfast, was that the classic illustration is the rise of the Nazis. And Hitler even used this. There's a famous speech, it might be even in Leni Riefenstahl's documentary, Triumph of the Will. And Hitler's mocking that Germany has a party for everything. There's a political party for farmers, and there's a political party for small farmers in Bavaria, and there's a political party for coal miners. And there was a time when Germany had 37 political parties. And so their parliamentary system, and if you get so many votes, you can get someone from your, coal miners party in Bavaria with representatives into the Reichstag. And the Nazis, they never got over 50% of the vote. But at one time, they had the most seats, and they had 37% of the seats in the Reichstag. But with so many parties, as you say, you might need something in, the mid-20, upper 20s, or even in the 30% range to have the majority party, which is then how you end up with the chancellor in that system. And the chancellor was appointed by the president, Hindenburg, of Germany. So the Nazis don't win half of the population ever, because right after they won, 44% was the highest vote they ever got. They immediately started to slide backwards. And so when Hitler's coming to power, it's really in the upper 30s, but with that party system just across the board, this fringe group gets in, and then one of the first things they do is to outlaw all other political parties. And so here's a political party with a little over a third of the people in Germany voting them into power in the Reichstag. And then the president has to make some deal with a person that he loathes, that he doesn't like. And then Hindenburg dies, and Hitler combines the office of chancellor and president, and then it's a one-party system. Yeah, it's interesting. And what looks much more democratic really lent itself to the abuse. And this was a philosophy, I think, both of the Nazis and the communists in the Soviet Union. We will use certain aspects of democracy in order to destroy democracy. And then both end up in these totalitarian systems, one-party systems. And so then all of a sudden, a two-party system with an occasional third party popping up every once in a while doesn't look too bad. I just made a comment the other day because it seems increasingly we get fringe, a radical fringe that has more of a voice. Some of that has to do with social media and other, places that you can have a platform. But by and large, in our country, we've avoided that Europeans have been so susceptible to. Italy was susceptible to it even before Germany. And it is that multi-party parliamentary system that kind of lent itself. We still have a two-party system, but it does seem that our politics, in an American sense, Europeans probably in some ways think you haven't seen really extreme radical politics in your country. Most of our arguments are most of the left and the right. It's just to the left of center and just to the right of center. That's where we've mostly lived for 2 centuries plus. And it's what looks like a good idea that lent itself to the very rapid rise of totalitarian systems. So yeah, that's one of those strange ironies of history.
A good example of this can be seen in Italy with Mussolini.
There are about a dozen Italian parties in the general election of 1921, and there are centrist parties. The largest party was kind of a revolutionary socialist party, had about a quarter, about 24% of the vote. And the next largest party has about 20%, and it's kind of a Christian Democrat party, a Catholic center party kind of thing. And the fascists, who are already there, they're already on the scene, they're at the very bottom of about a dozen parties, and they had less than 1% of the vote. In the 1921 general election, they had 0.4%. So out of 535 seats in the Italian parliament, they got 2 seats, but they have a seat. They have a legitimate seat at the table and gives them some kind of legitimacy.
Hometown History is brought to you by Liquid IV. If you're like me, you might have ignored your fitness goals because of the crazy year we had indoors. But this year, I've established a new fitness routine that involves an indoor bike every morning. Staying hydrated is always a worry for me because if I slip, it can really impact the rest of my working day. What I've found that works for me is to use 1 stick of Liquid IV in my 16-ounce bottle. I prefer the strawberry. I drink half right before the workout and the other half immediately following. You know that feeling after you work out when it seems like you just can't drink enough water? Well, Liquid IV has 2 to 3 times the amount of hydration as plain water. It has 3 times the electrolytes as traditional sport drinks, and has more vitamin C than an orange, and has as much potassium as a banana. There are no artificial flavors or preservatives, and it has less sugar than an apple. Liquid IV is made of clean ingredients, non-GMO, vegan, and free of gluten, dairy, and soy. Grab your strawberry Liquid IV or their other great flavors in bulk nationwide at Costco. Or you can get 25% off when you go to liquidiv.com and use code HOMETOWN at checkout. That's 25% off anything when you use promo code HOMETOWN at liquidiv.com. Get better hydration today at liquidiv.com, promo code HOMETOWN. If you enjoy listening to Hometown History, then you will love to hear that we've got brand new content going live on the Stereo app 3 times a week. If you listen and wish you could interact and ask questions, or maybe even contribute, well, now you can. You'll be able to talk with us directly on Stereo while we are live. This is completely exclusive to the Stereo app. You won't be able to find these podcasts anywhere else. Stereo is the live social conversation app where you can be a co-host, part of the conversation, or simply just listen. Last week, I had a really good discussion with our hometown history writer, Nick Deneff. We talked in more detail about some of the stories that we've covered, and some of you even joined in and contributed your knowledge. So take out your smartphone right now and go to stereo.com/hometownhistory. Again, just open a browser on your phone and go to stereo.com/hometownhistory. Join us 3 times each week on the Stereo app. That's stereo.com/hometownhistory.
There were rural socialists, SRs, the social revolutionaries, the SDs, the social democrats, those were the communists. But even the communists divided into the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. And then there are they were called the cadets. This is kind of a constitutional party that was more conservative. You have some monarchists who are actually interested in helping get the czar back in power. So a similar kind of thing, not as dramatic, and with those 40 parties in Germany. And then with the rise of Hitler, that's just what makes it so spectacular.
When you have a 2-party system, you don't have to fear the political influence of the American Nazi Party. Yes, there really is one, and it's headquartered in Arlington, Virginia. We can despise the values and agendas of parties like this, but we don't have to fear them as a political force, because in a 2-party deadlock, they can never break through. Because unlike in Italy in 1921, a fringe party with 2% of the vote doesn't get a seat at the table.
They're outside the mainstream. So you have those groups, you have those radical groups in our country, but because you have 2 parties, to have a real chance to hold office, to be a legislator, everything gets pushed to the middle and has a moderating influence, because you've got to be in, and every once in a while you'll have someone who probably started as a Republican or a Democrat and then declares themselves to be independent, but they really came out of that and it's just one tiny step removed. Whereas with this wide spectrum, you probably have, even in the European countries, most of the people are in the middle. But because you've given an opportunity for the group on the widest fringe from the center to have some kind of representative in your legislature, in your Reichstag or whatever it's called, there's a tendency probably with the Europeans to make coalitions. And as you say, you so demonize the other that you're afraid of, and you find yourself not staying in the middle, but moving further away as far as you can from that one extreme to the other extreme. And then that's what's odd. It's the extremes that begin to look so much like each other as they blossom into a one-party totalitarian state. That was Hannah Arendt's conclusion in her study of totalitarianism. It's not the contrast of National Socialism, the Nazis, or fascism and communism. It's how they look so much alike. Yeah, probably most people there too, they start in the middle, but you have a place to go, and so you're pushed out. In America, it seems to be the other way. You might have these fringe groups, but in order to gain some kind of respectability, they have to identify with somebody in the middle. So it has a moderating influence.
I always thought that the 2-party system was a terrible system. And it is, but it's not the worst thing that can happen to us, as history makes clear. If we did see a sudden proliferation of powerful parties in the United States, things would get more interesting for sure. It would be exciting at first, and people would feel more represented than ever before. The UAW, the Auto Workers Union, for example, might have its very own party. Small farmers who so often struggle to thrive in our modern economy, might have a party that truly represented their interests to the rest of the nation. But the gigantic voting blocks that currently draw 70 or 80 million in two-party elections would begin to fragment, and radicals on both sides of the aisle who have had to moderate their agendas in the past might have a real chance of achieving national power. I used to think that being stuck with two mediocre candidates every 4 years was a failure of our democracy. I also used to think that an ideal national debate would involve a chorus of golden-throated fringe players. But after this conversation, I've come to realize that I've been describing every maniacal dictator from the 20th century. Our republic is a fragile thing, an imperfect thing, but our world is imperfect. Sometimes discretion is the better form of valor, and sometimes the highest aspiration is simply damage control. And hey, I'm still in favor of a good third party. It's the 37th party that concerns me. In our next conversation with Mark, we're going to be looking at America's national bird, the bald eagle, and why Benjamin Franklin was not a fan. What did he prefer instead? The wild turkey. In the next episode, I'll tell you why. Before I let you go, if you've enjoyed this episode and would like to join the live conversations, you can join me over on the Stereo app 3 times each week. Our most recent Stereo show went a little like this. Whatever happened to their cult? I think that you mentioned there are 2 people who are still saying that they're in it.
Well, when he went before the Michigan Supreme Court finally, and we've, I think, both read all the court documents, it's crazy. He was getting ready to go to prison. He died. Part of his following refused to believe any of these claims, which are all well substantiated at this point. Another part did buy it. They went with his wife, Mary Purnell, to form the City of David across the street. So you had these rival cults across the street from each other. The City of David, I believe, is the one that endures this to this day, with 2 new members who joined in the 40s or 50s. I've contacted them. I've spoken with them on the phone. I thought at one point that it would be, I mean, they're definitely struggling to upkeep, to keep up the property, to just go spend a few days helping them do stuff and listening to some oral histories. But I've not actually gotten around to doing it. I still think it'd be fun. But they are waiting right now in Benton Harbor for the second coming of Jesus Christ, who is going to take them to heaven, and I guess it's going to be a 2-person rapture. And I'm not saying that to ridicule it, but
Right.
These are true. They're true believers, and they can't be having a lot of fun there right now, but they're hanging tough. It's. They would be very interesting to speak with, I think. And I'm sure they'd be guarded too. They must be deeply wounded at this point to have waited for so long